Hey Andrew,
Hello, guys.
hello, how are you?
Hey.
You made it back from health as well, did you?
I did, yeah. It was
I was there for what, like 2 minutes, was it?
ha ha.
I know,
You're
I
not
didn't
the
even get to
most,
meet you.
most
You were
efficient
gone.
person I know. You know,
Oh, I
uh,
just did the wave.
did the wave, shook some
Sure.
hands. Yeah, yeah. Pull it. Oh, so Andrew is a partner at Erisbeg, a private equity firm. Prior to that, he was the co-founder, and chairman of Robotify, and he was on the board of Health Excel, and too many boards now and too many companies to for me to remember, Andrew. But you started way back. So do you want to give a little bit of background on kind of where you started and bring us trying to join the dots in the middle here?
Sure, yeah. I'm originally a chemical engineer, so a little bit of an eclectic background. Started my career working as a plant engineer in an adhesives plant with ankle Loctite. So to give a kind of a bit of insight, the adhesive was like super glue, and we would have produced in my plant everything for EMEA. So for me, one of the key things was very early on, I got responsibility for the control system, which brought me into the world of code. So I had to learn very quickly how to decipher hexadecimal sequencing. And from that, I felt, well, the next guy probably isn't going to be able to do this or want to do this. So I set about sort of replacing the whole SCADA infrastructure in the plant and rewrote that in my spare time after sort of 5 p.m. every evening. And over the course of 2 years, we'd replace everything and future proofed it. So I kind of with code, I knew enough to be dangerous, knew enough as to what could be developed, and if I had something to play with, I knew how to replicate and improve it. Did a few other sort of projects to automate a lot of aspects of the plant and ultimately reduce a lot of headcount. But to me, it was and productivity and all that kind of lovely jazz. But in doing an MBA part time, I felt I wanted to do something different, and I was looking at moving a lot and moving on. I did a project on uh, a colleague in the MBA's major problem as director of finance in the largest hospital in Ireland at the time, where he couldn't convert um, treatment of private patients into cash. So the revenue cycle process was a little bit broken, and there was no real rules of engagement or protocols across the Irish market. Um, Looking at it from a kind of a my kind of Six Sigma or breaking down processes viewpoint, I said it can't be that difficult to solve. And I kind of went in, did a review, and I said, "Here's what I would do if I was you," and just gave him the blueprint. Um, as we were finishing the MBA, this is mid 2006. He kind of told me that nobody wanted to touch it with a barge pole. It was just too complicated, too many vested interests, and of course that was like
Red
a
rag to a
beacon
bull.
for me. It was like a siren call. Um,
I'll show them.
so
I'll show those
I
doctors how to do it.
well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'll do it. And
And were you still working in the factory at the time in the plant?
yeah, I was plant manager at the time,
Wow.
but it was easy. Like it was, I was getting bored. I
Yeah.
was kind of and Henkel were offering me a bigger role, maybe across a couple of other plants, potentially a role in Dusseldorf, and I was like, it's going to just the same shit, only bigger. So,
Except I had to
um,
learn German, yeah.
well, I was still pretty decent at German at that stage,
Oh, okay, okay.
So no, so this is better. I raided my wife's savings, remortgaged the house, and just as you do.
And you're still married, right? As far as I remember.
Yeah, that's a curious one. We just had our first child as well. Like,
Okay.
she was a few months old. So yeah, all the
Oh,
milestones ready to
congrats.
go, you know. So,
All in.
uh, but look, again, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't
Yeah.
know healthcare really. I had no network in it apart from this one
Hold
contact.
on, hold on a minute. So they said this is a crazy idea. You said I'm going to give it a shot. You jacked in your job. You
Yeah, I checked in my job in October that year. Yeah,
and you started the company.
Took your
Um,
wife's money, and then you
yeah,
started the company. Don't forget that.
yeah. I took in a small bit of extra of money. This Martin knows this a little bit better, but I asked, what I thought was sort of a seasoned entrepreneur to sort of be involved. He put a very modest amount of money in. I kind of gave him half the company, which came back to bite me much later.
mm,
Um, so it was interesting. I had a fair shape of what the solution should be.
yeah,
Um, you know, but I hadn't really put together a detailed plan as to sort of how I was going to execute it.
yeah,
Um, and building a new product from scratch is something I hadn't done before. So and basically the I did a deal with the hospital on a no full no fee basis. So we either increased their cash receipts from privately insured claims, or and if we did, we took a cut of it. If not, I was out of pocket and I took all the risk.
right.
So look, I kind of I would tend to back myself, and I did obviously, but it was a little bit reckless looking back, because ultimately
Just a
to
little
solve this problem had to not just build a product but also
build a company.
address the ecosystem. So to bring it wasn't just dealing with the finance department in the hospital. We had to change how their admissions function worked a little bit, their workflow and how they captured information. Had to engage with medical consultants and their input required in order to sign off a claim. Unlike the US, where there's a differentiated claim for the physician and the hospital, they're two different processes that only get pulled together at TPA level or the insurer level. In Ireland, um, the insurers only assessed a fully consolidated claim. And so part of my job was as a system, was to pull that together and ensure that everything tallied up between the physician's notes and the hospital's bills, etc.
And Andrew, how did
Yeah.
you how did you really understand who your customer and client and like all the different players were? How did you really kind of get underneath all that and go, okay, this is the person that's going to pay the money, and this is what I need to do. Like, tell us a little bit about that process from the
So,
initial contact,
so
which it can't be done, to like, okay, I'm going to show you how it's done.
yeah, so a good question. I mean, key thing for me was, who do I need to get on board? Who needs to be on board for a claim to go all the way through? They're your internal stakeholders. So you needed, you know, people in like, if people in admissions did capture the right information, ask whether a patient was, and sorry, another difference in the Irish market is, this was an academic teaching public hospital, but in Ireland they get to treat private patients as well. Approximately 20% of the patient throughput would be private patients. So someone has to ask that question at admissions, capture the information. If the patient is elected to be private, all of that information wasn't really being captured robustly at all. So we had to sort of change those protocols. So they needed to be on board. Um, Obviously, the people responsible for managing the patient accounts needed to be on board, and that was a key function. But what was what was very obvious to me early on was that they had responsibility for lots of inputs that they didn't have control or visibility over. So we had to get the medical consultants on board, not just say the surgeons, but the radiologists, the pathologists, the anesthetists. They all sort of needed to sort of tie together as well, because they all generated their own invoices and bills. And whoever was the admitting medical consultant would have to physically sign off. So I had to address dealing with that both on, being able to scan in signed documents or to enable electronic signatures, which in turn meant I had to deal with the insurers and get them to accept electronic signatures. And there was a whole sort of runway. What I focused on in all of that was trying to address the what's in it for me question for every one of those stakeholders. So both internal in the hospital and in the claims or revenue cycle process, but also when it came to dealing with the insurers. I mean, on paper, they were the ones with the biggest vested interest for this not to work. Okay,
Right.
because if it was a consolidated claim in paper, and that paper, was often sent in the back of taxis to them, suddenly gets lost. Maybe it's worth 70, $80,000 or euros. It's a huge amount of work for that body of work to be recreated. You have to go back to the patient's home, get their signatures, get their approval. Similarly with all the medical consultants, etc. So it kind of suited them that it was a pretty dysfunctional sort of reimbursement cycle. But what I kind of got to with them was, hang on, the efficiency is all going to happen here in the hospital, and if you lose a claim, we can regenerate it at a touch of a button. So you've lost that gain anyway. You might as well get the benefit of ingesting these claims electronically into your systems and get your own benefits on that. And we can also offer some greater visibility on sort of work in progress at the hospital level. So your accruals for potential claim liability are more accurate, etc. So that was the angle of attack on that. We ultimately, by degrees, got them on board, but it was very, very slow. And
Who is we, Andrew? I mean, it's you. So I mean, clearly you have an affinity for really understanding how to identify the pieces of the puzzle, put systems together, and understand how to get stakeholders aligned to a story. What's the WIFM per stakeholder? But then on the internal side, on your company side, who was that? Who was doing that with you? How did you start to think about who you wanted to do that with, and what kind of capabilities you needed? Or
so for the first couple of years, it was pretty much me, and I had a tech team outsourced in the Philippines that were technically fine, but were a bit challenged in terms of interpreting what I wanted. It took me a little bit of time to figure out that. Once I had made progress with demonstrating that the impact in that first customer, one of my key priorities was to start hiring an on-site tech team, and I'm still working with one or two of my first hires in different roles, and a key piece for me was then I wasn't satisfied at how robust the system was, and ultimately you could argue that the early impacts in the first hospital were as much to do with me effectively living in the patient accounts department and driving behavior and driving sort of performance than the actual technology. But then as the product improved, it became sort of self-sustaining. So then, I would say it took it took about 4 years, I'd say, to get to 10 people. And then we sort of, jumped a bit then. Now the other element.
You didn't have a co-founder, like you were.
Oh.
And who did you turn to? Or did you turn to anyone to kind of 4 years is a long time to be sweating it?
And particularly the latter two of those were the kickoff of the great recession in Ireland. No capital. One of my biggest concerns was that we had shown demonstrable and repeatable impacts on the cash receipts for the hospital that were very sustainable. So just to put it in numbers, the first hospital, the baseline we used for the kind of commission model was 2006's cash receipts, which at the time were about 12.5 million. It took we only went live in August the following year, but I was restricted to gains in 2007. But they took in the last 4 months an extra 6 to 7 million in cash versus the equivalent period the year before. That wasn't just to pull through debtors. It was a much better use of their economic private beds, etc. So that went to like 18 million in 18.5 million in 2007. It went to 24 the year after and beyond, and it just kept growing. And we were able to show that then with the next hospital and the next hospital, which were both tortuous kind of deals to get over the line due to public procurement rules, etc., which I didn't really understand coming into setting up the company, which I could argue was a bit of an oversight. But it was like 5 years before the Irish Health Service said, well, there's something, and we should do this at scale. This was a time when the IMF were coming into Ireland. At that point, right, because of the scale of the crash in the economy.
And did that help, Andrew? Did that help having the IMF sort of say, why don't you?
It ultimately did, but I had been naively of the view after showing the impact on the first hospital that there'd be a queue around the door, right? A queue out the street. Please, can we be next? Because it was free money, And then the view was, well, we're far better than that. We wouldn't have. That was the view of everybody, and I would see this consistently in healthcare. This kind of not invented here syndrome. We've got a solution here. That's fine, and we're all right, Jack. Right?
Yeah.
And you can't go in and tell someone that their baby is ugly, right? So you need to be very, very careful as to sort of how you manage that objection. And what I tended to have to move towards was, the initial response would be, we're the best performing hospital in the country in this area. And my response would be, oh, wow, I'd love to learn from you. Can I sit down and walk through that? Now, by the end of that discussion, it would be like, oh my God, we're an absolute shit show. But they had to say that. I couldn't tell them, but like I've seen it in different areas of healthcare as well, and not just in the Irish market, but any market I've been into. It's that sort of the walls are up first.
Yeah.
And you got to gently sort of massage them to drop them. And then you can have an actual proper conversation.
So even though you were in effect kind of doubling their cash, which is like, amazing, right? It was still this hard slog of like telling them they were great, and then eventually got a bit momentum. But back to Sarah's question, you were doing that with your tech team, but then at what point did you you built a big company? There was a lot of people. Tell us a little bit about the kind of the initial folks who then took it to the next stage with you and helped you scale.
Yeah, so I guess.
Sorry, and building just on that one with Martin, like who was your first co-leader? What role was it, and who was it?
CTO. I had been speaking to him. He was on the MBA with me when I sort of conceived of this, and we worked in the same team through 3 of the 4 semesters of the MBA. So like we got on really well, and we had good. He was a great foil. So I had been speaking to him about potentially being on the board. And then he was just coming out of, which I wasn't aware of, he was coming out of a company he had co-founded. So he agreed to come on as CTO. That meant, okay, I could deal with that. he was very credible and very credible in front of customers, and was astute commercially. So that was a great kind of concern taken away from me, even though it did mean, oh well, I need this, I need this, I need this.
Yeah.
I had to try and sort of figure out how to resource what was required to deliver a scalable product. The next pillar of the what was ultimately the SLT was actually my sister. We had who, in spite of the fact of her relation with me, we had a client down in Cork, southern part of Ireland, that we had signed a contract with. We couldn't get any traction. We couldn't get them to move. So about 12 months in, my sister had taken some time out. She had been leading projects with Icon, a CRO, for a few years that, obviously Martin knows well through G. So I knew she was very capable, and I just asked, look, could you do a bit of project management for me just to get this moving? So she did, and we were like live within about 4 or 5 weeks. And I was like, okay. And then she was like, but you're missing this, and you're missing this. Why aren't you sorting this out? And ultimately, if you can figure this stuff out, great. And gradually, she became someone that just I didn't have to think about the Irish system at all. She ultimately ran the Irish business over time. We got to a stage when we did get that HSE national rollout. We were able to roll. This is a fairly complex implementation, right? So, you're changing lots of stuff. There's a lot of integration, a lot of workflow changes, etc., and a lot of money involved. And our first implementations, could be like the Cork one, well over a year or whatever. We were effectively smashing these live in 6 to 8 weeks in parallel with others. Right. So we got the entire Irish health system rolled out onto this in about 18 months because we had those protocols in place. And that gave me a lot of confidence for the next phase of getting into medical records. So they were the key ones. I really didn't have a finance department for 6-7 years. I kind of managed the business on cash flow Excel. And we had a bookkeeper and we had good auditors and all that kind of stuff, but we actually didn't have an accountant on staff until 2012, 2013, I'd say.
But can you dive into that IMF bit again? Because we kind of glossed over that quickly, but when you think of healthcare implementation, it's already complicated enough, right? Like you're like, oh, it's a highly regulated industry, all this change management, all this behavior, all these systems and payers and insurance. And then in your case, you had and then the IMF showed up. That's not a usual part of the story. So
and again,
just tell that story a little bit more.
Yeah, the Irish market, again, touched on it earlier, but it is slightly unusual, right? So it's dominated by the public healthcare system, okay? There are about, 10 meaningful acute private hospitals also in the system. Of the public hospitals, certainly at that time, most medical consultants working in the public hospitals also had rights to treat private patients. So they could do these on site, and there was a limit effectively of 20% of their activity could be private, but they also had rights then to do private work outside in the private hospitals, etc. So you have despite this sort of effectively universal access to public healthcare, you had over 50% of the population with private health insurance.
Right.
It's not employer mandated. It's often given as an employer perk or whatever, but and there's some modest sort of tax incentives for it, but effectively people have it not because the quality of care in the public system isn't good. It's some of the best doctors in the world. It's effectively the same doctors. It's access to care that it provides. It's so, rather than waiting a year and a half for an MRI, you can just go in and just get it, right? So that's sort of that's the reason most people would have it. And in the event of major elective surgery, so a hip replacement or knees, that sort of stuff, that's typically why people would have it. So in that context, health was consuming, and it still does consume, a significant amount of government expenditure. At the time, it was about 15 billion euro. Irish government's tax take dropped by 30 odd percent, pretty much over a 2-year period. So what that meant was, like, where's the money coming from to fund this, right? And the country was borrowing money it was difficult to borrow money on the market, which is why the IMF had to be called in. You had, effectively, because it was a debt crisis, all the money came out of the market, even for sovereigns. And we went from a AAA rating to, I think, BB2 or something like that. Anyway, almost junk status as a sovereign. So we couldn't borrow on the international markets. And in order to regain investor confidence in sovereign bonds in Ireland, there had to be significant tightening of spend in with the government finances. As part of basically a bailout, the IMF came in and made a number of recommendations that really there wasn't much of an opportunity to negotiate out of. So that was the kind of backdrop, and yet you had this fairly straightforward, easy win here that kind of nobody was paying attention to. I recall there's an auditor of government spending. So it's a national controller and auditor general in Ireland, and issues a report every year about areas to improve in terms of government spending and waste. And I remember being really happy 2 or 3 years in a row, this report referencing the impact of ClaimSure, my product. And yet the cause and effect, like, who's going to do anything about it? So you gotta just, like, I had to lobby politicians, and at the end of the day, it was still a public competition, so somebody else tried to copy our system and win it because they were a bigger company, So,
so that's brutal, but you hacked your way through. You hacked your way through that, and it was really successful to the point where then it wasn't for you, right?
Well, so pretty early on, I viewed the ClaimSure business as a kind of a means to an end. I did look at potentially bringing a solution like that to the US market. I mapped out the US market. I felt that there was a clear market opportunity. When I mapped out the typical reimbursement process or the revenue cycle process in the US, I felt ClaimSure did about 10 different individual products tended to do within the market. And I thought that there was potentially huge efficiency for TPAs and insurers if you could consolidate the physician and hospital reimbursement system. And so, because one of the things that I saw was that the details on the hospital claim, I think it was UBO4, I think was the name of it, and the details on the physician claim typically only matched in 50% of cases. So if you just think of the inefficiency that comes out of that and the waste, I thought, okay, there's a huge opportunity here. But again, given the backdrop I've just given about the Irish economy, that also applied to access to capital and all of that kind of stuff. So I knew I would need a material amount of capital to really go after that, even if I felt that the concept would work. So I kind of said, right, ClaimSure is an Irish solution for the Irish market, and we're just leaving it at that. And when I looked at bigger opportunities, I was looking at the medical record side of things. And so this is the product called Vitro, and felt that that would be where I tried to scale internationally rather than ClaimSure. So once we had sort of got a bit of momentum on ClaimSure, Maeve and Billy were kind of handling that, or Maeve in particular, the rollouts. I was focused then on conceiving the Vitro product, which I kind of initially came out of a conversation with one of our customers, and came also from my observation of nurses and doctors interacting with a classic sort of US sourced EMR, where they would just bounce off it. It just didn't fit their workflow. It wasn't something that they really logged into, and sort of kept reverting back to paper, which, again, looking at it from their perspective, they had defined what information to capture in their paper chart over a course of 20, 30 years. That forms committees, that a lot of people committed that this is how we capture this clinical event, or this fluid balance, or whatever it was, right? And I thought, well, you could work with that and get them on reduce that step from paper to electronic by mimicking the data entry effectively, or the forms that they were used to using in the medical chart, pre-populating them appropriately with any integrated data, and then also enable them to do things like signing and drawing, and to have automated interpretations of information, and just have that familiarity while getting all the benefits of going electronic. So, and the word vitro really came from people kept talking about it. Oh, it's paper on glass, and so vitro on glass, or it's a Latin word for glass. So that was kind of where I focused. While we were building up ClaimSure, I was focusing on the next phase. Arguably, I probably should have done that in a different company, but anyway, you live and learn. So,
and who was investing, or where were you getting your capital from then at that time for Vitro? Where were you getting?
It was very. I didn't like. There was no VCs in Vitro. There was no I had to fund this from cash generated by the ClaimSure business.
Yeah.
And that was actually something I needed to watch culturally, because my team on ClaimSure were killing themselves, bringing in the money, and the development team on Vitro looked like it was sort of yeah, it's just 2 drinks minimum, So that was a little bit of a challenge. It wasn't a major one, but I guess what we did with Vitro was really plan it, and again, it was the benefit of having Billy there as CTO. we put the groundwork in to make it very scalable internationally. So, like, one of our first wins, actually our first win, was in the Middle East, where Cerner was everywhere. Okay, so in fact, probably Cerner owned Seha, which is the Abu Dhabi health system more than Seha owned Cerner. But they had gaps, right? And there are things that they couldn't capture electronically, etc. So there was a tender there for capturing signatures and that sort of stuff. And it was like, we could do a lot more, but we could do this. And we won that. And one of the basis we won it on was the fact that, depending on the user, if they wanted to see it in Arabic, they could see it in Arabic. If another user wanted their personal profile was set up to see it in Dutch, they could see it in Dutch, etc., etc. So and every string in the application you could tailor to any user profile, right? In any language or whatever. So that was very helpful. But again, going back to sort of the similarities between your typical administrator in a healthcare system, no matter what domain, this was a fairly simple implementation. Should have taken 4 or 5 weeks. It took like a year and a half. Just there were project meetings with 26 people from the client side turning up and having arguments with each other, completely unrelated to the project. But look, we got it live, but there's still about 85 facilities using this today down there. So, and then in terms of selecting new markets, again, I felt that the US was just too big of a capital challenge. And it's sort of that underlines a lot, really. We ultimately only got a tiny amount of institutional money when we didn't need it, actually. And that tends to be what happened. So I used Enterprise Ireland, which is a state entity that does invest in Irish startups, but also is mandated to assist them in growing exports. And I would have gone on a couple of trade missions with them to assess a couple of markets. And we did one to the Australian market and got a lot of positive feedback there. And that became it still is the biggest market for vitro with, I don't know, there's about 15 to 20 sites using it across public and private, from patient portals to end-of-bed community charts to all sorts, right? So, and again, I guess in terms of sort of where it went, that was building up well. That did need more capital. That kind of helped me kind of decide when I got an approach to sell the company. So there's a USP-backed health tech roll-up company that made an approach. I said, I won't sell you the whole company, but I'll sell you ClaimSure. So I did a deal with them on that in 2015. That for me was to prime the balance sheet for a strong Series A of 20 odd million, which is what I felt it would take to consolidate our progress in Australia, but really launch properly in the US market. I had an agreement with so the Australian Stock Exchange at the time was quite hungry for companies that are a little bit higher up the risk register, but potentially deliver better returns. A lot of our revenues were coming from the Australian market with great case studies down there. So it sort of fitted. And so speaking to a couple of investment banks, we engaged with one. They pretty much had us nailed for a float at a certain valuation that would raise about 20 million. Unfortunately, that would have meant to sort of rehash at the board that I had kind of neglected. I had let this person that I'd given a lot, half the shares to, kind of bring his buddies on. He had put a little bit more money over time that I didn't have, so he had acquired, a majority over me. And by the time I kind of really paid attention to that, it was his club. So they didn't like the idea of raising. And they thought, well, hang on, we've all this cash from the ClaimSure sale. Can we just hold on to that? And I said, well, no, at the time, we had about 15 go live that year. Right, really, some really big case study sites that would, really changed the perception of Vitro in terms of the breadth of capability and the ease of use and all of that. So I said, I'm not cutting back on our ability to deliver here. So no, we need to raise money, even though we've got this. And so that created a lot of friction, and ultimately it became very personal very quickly. Even though I felt I wasn't being personal, and ended up, look, I got support to offer a buyout. That wasn't accepted. Ultimately, there was no moving. So in like July, August 2016, I stepped away from the company with, I had to leave it all behind. So even though I had quite a big number on the value of my shares, etc., from the discussions, you know what? I felt, well, I'm not going to realize that with these guys, and I'm not going to spend my life banging my head against the brick wall with people like this. So I had to step away and decide, look, decide to resist the idea of doing a 2.0, right? Because that would be the egotistical thing to do. So instead, I sort of, started getting involved in a number of things where I felt could learn from how other people ran their businesses and hopefully add a bit of value as well, until I decided what I really wanted to sort of bottom out on. And that's been enjoyable, and I don't regret it at all,
It's an
Of course,
amazing story, Andrew, to start a company with your own money and family money, to build a company, to build almost like a second company, to go through all those hard yards, to focus on the customer and to make sure you're delivering, and then to really figure out that, by giving away so much, ultimately then he lost
yeah.
control, and
It,
then
it, it took 10 years to be punished for a rookie mistake,
yeah,
back in 2006.
yeah. And I've heard you tell every young entrepreneur that don't give it
Yeah.
away, right? And every
Well, I didn't even have a shareholders agreement, so it was like it was
yeah,
just
yeah. And from my perspective, every cloud has a silver lining, because I got to meet you at that point, and it was like, hey, come and help Health Excel, and that's been a great partnership for the last whatever 8 years. But
yeah.
you bounce back incredibly quickly. Shows huge resilience. And then the next thing I know, you saying to me, hey, you want to put some money into Robotify, and that took off like a rocket, and it was hard to keep up with all the deals you were doing. So you went from the detail of like what form had to get filled in what country to get reimbursement, to like managing multiple relationships and operationally and strategically, into what you're doing today. And how many boards are you sitting on right now? Do you know?
I couldn't count the number of boards, but I guess in terms of active involvement in companies between Erisbeg, so Erisbeg is a buy and build fund, so it's a platform company, and then bolt-ons, and I would take quite an operational role as chairman in the ones that I take responsibility for. I would guess, there's about 12, 13 there, right? So there's kind of four platforms, but then there's the sub boards, and then there's boards of the other companies across the fund that I'd still be actively on the board, but don't take direct responsibility for. And then in Merview, so that's my investment holding company where I take minority stakes. I only go in where I feel I have some influence and feel I can add some value in the direction of travel of the business. So I'm reasonably active there. So there's about 6 or 7 there as well. But life is short and variety is brilliant,
Twice a life. Okay. All right.
yeah. Like for me, I just want to keep learning, right? So, and hopefully helping people along the way, and giving something of value. alongside money. But it's yeah, I'm kind of I have trouble a little saying no, right? Because I'm actually I do get excited about looking at uh, different businesses, and because I guess I've been in a few different sectors, either as an operator or an active investor, I'm immediately drawn to something new that maybe I have a tangential understanding of, but I'd like to know more.
Mhm.
So I am curious, but in certain cases I'd be quite definitive as to what's going to work, what's not going to work.
Yeah.
Uh,
So tell us, this podcast is about building great companies, right? So you shared
mm.
your own experience, but then you've picked a role model. So let's tell us who your role model is and why you picked them.
Well, I wouldn't call it a role model. It's a company. So I'm at DCC PLC, and what I really like about them is their consistency. And they
And maybe
originally,
just for the
yeah.
audience, a little bit of context of who they are, because maybe not everyone will have heard of them.
So DCC PLC is an Irish industrial holding company ultimately, that is part of the FTSE 100. It has been going for since 1977. It's effectively like an Irish Berkshire Hathaway. Okay.
Okay.
Now it started more like a venture capital firm. DCC actually stands for Development Capital Corporation, and it was to provide sort of growth capital for scale ups. And I think their original, the first deal they did, it was led by and founded by quite an inspirational guy called Jim Flavin, and he led the business for I don't know 25-30 years. Um, but what I like is because to some extent I straddle that world where I do a bit of venture and sort of I kind of like that. I've invested in pre-revenue to profitable businesses to then do buyouts. So I've kind of seen the range of investing models. Um, and I do know a number of people who've come through the DCC world, okay, and I have a huge amount of respect for them. So Jim Flavin seemed to have that sort of entrepreneurial type view and would take calculated risks. As the company has evolved, it became more like I wouldn't say PE, but very financially disciplined, really good at um, building on their core business and driving organic growth, incentivizing management well, creating a good culture, identifying really accretive M&A, being very disciplined on M&A and really understanding sort of the financial impact of and synergies of doing a deal rather than it being a deal for ego, because that's where M&A fails. Um, and from that, gradually getting a bit more sophisticated with integrating bolt-ons, having really good management systems, and becoming a bit of a flywheel. Um, but also the discipline in getting out of things where they felt that we need to change direction. So, for example, they sold, I think, a home building business in 2007, just before the market went backwards, deliver great returns. And then they focused on, well, how do we use this capital to drive another area? So at the moment, I mean, they did have four divisions or five divisions. They have three core divisions now. Healthcare, sorry, energy is their biggest one, right? So, but that's a lot of oil and gas, and that is a challenge for them on the share price because even though it's performing, it's not an especially well loved sector. Then they have a healthcare division, which has always performed well and delivers, great returns, and then they have a technology business. They're also in waste and and in food, and they divested those over time. What they've been really disciplined on is return on capital, and sort of using that as the basis to decide on their allocations across various divisions, and that creates a sort of a healthy basis to avoid this sort of ego-driven sort of mentality of, well, people building empires for the sake of empires, etc. So all of that, and there's a general humility to them. You don't see them doing rah rah rah. Look at how great we are. We've shown consistent, like their financial returns have been very, very solid over an extendedly long 30-year odd period. And sometimes they're not fully rewarded with that on the stock market, largely because of the drag due to their exposure to energy. But as they've continued to evolve, and even now they're evolving into more renewable energy and that sort of stuff. So there's definitely I guess just that ongoing renewal and growth while still making all the numbers, and that's really impressive to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Martin told you that his pick was Guinness, so I love how both the Irish guys so far in the podcast picked Irish companies.
Well,
You guys are really proud.
Yours was
I guess
Berkshire
you know,
Hathaway,
I know, mine was Berkshire Hathaway, so I can't talk.
when Martin said to me, I said, "Well, I'm not going to talk about a company I don't know, right?" So,
Yeah.
so like unless I'm in a company or I've very intimate association with it, all I'll be getting from the web is that company's PR, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
true.
I mean,
True, fair.
enough for me.
But let's talk about so when you describe DCC, you describe this real like financially savvy, good financial rigor, right? And process. And then you talk about, when you talk about more of your venture portfolio yourself, right? Things you invest in, you talk a bit about this desire to learn more, to be super curious and to get involved. And so those are kind of two different ways of looking at companies, let's say. And like, how does that shape, like, what's a great, how do those two inputs now, when you think about all the things you said in the last hour, has that changed at all? Or how does that shape a bit about how you might start to think about defining a great company?
It definitely does. So when I say, I'm curious about things, but I'm also very, very, I do apply quite a lot of financial discipline. So sometimes if I make an offer to invest, it mightn't be on terms that people necessarily want, and the choice is, look, that's fine. I'm not dying to invest in new things, but my exposure on the buyout side does influence my thinking on the minority investment side. So to take an example, we had there was a company I looked at that was it's actually in the healthcare compliance space. So I had a profitable company that I had already done a deal with. They did a number of quality assurance services, but they also had a tech side that in itself was about $1 million ARR. Okay, but the overall company was profitable to the tune of nearly €1 million. Okay, and we agreed a multiple on EBITDA as an enterprise value for that business. Okay, of call it X, right? I looked at a similar business, except they didn't have the services capability. They didn't have profitability. They had a similar amount of ARR, but they were only tech, okay? And they were burning probably the equivalent of what the other company was making, okay? And I'm an LP in a venture fund that invested in those, and the fund rang me about it beforehand. And I said, well, I rate the guys, I rate the tech, but talk to me about valuation. And the view was, oh, well, we think the valuation is really, really good. we're very happy to go in at this. And I kind of explained the other company to the person from the fund, and the EV that they were proposing as a pre-money for this company was like 3x the profitable company. And that just kind of blows my mind a bit, right? So at the moment, I'm negotiating a term sheet with an investing company, right, in the healthcare space again. I'm trying to use what he needs. This founder needs money. I know the business very well, and I really rate the founder, and I really rate the opportunity. But the valuation he's looking for, to my mind, is something that the company would do well to achieve if it reached a certain amount of profitability and was sold in the market in 2 to 3 years' time. And that's the pre-money he's kind of looking for. And I'm saying, this is why this doesn't compute for me, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not being intransigent or not valuing you enough. It's just, the hope value, just, I don't, even today, it's a good result if you get to this level of profitability in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. You put it out in the market, you get a certain multiple of EBITDA. That'll be X. So what are my returns as an investor in that context? And just trying to explain that mentality to people that seems to be a little bit missing in lots of areas. And it's different to, like, some people kind of benchmark themselves off a Silicon Valley investment round or whatever. And we don't, and I'm speaking for myself here. In Ireland, we don't live in an ecosystem like that. Capital isn't as accessible, and the access to large markets is not as amenable because you can't leverage the kind of relationships that the guys in Silicon Valley can. And so, I have a very realistic and prudent approach to minority investing. And part of me is, look, if I'm going to do it, I need to, for various reasons, it needs to be a meaningful. It doesn't need to be double digit, but I need to have a meaningful bit of the business after I invest and after I commit my time to hopefully guide the business. But I also reserve against it. So there's one effectively pre-revenue company I've invested in that would it's a kind of a hardware as a service play to the biotech industry, and I've done 3 rounds with them, and I've led the last 2 because I felt the company needed it, and by the time they might have realized it themselves, they would have run out. So part of that is sort of self-preservation of the previous capital, but I wouldn't do it if I didn't believe that it was going in the right direction. So I would. There are a couple of investments I've just written off. Maybe something will happen with them, but I'm not afraid to sort of some costs and just deal with it. Because if you keep chasing the falling knife, that's not a great idea.
Yeah, fair enough.
Oh man, this could go on for like at least another hour. Like we haven't talked about loads of the other companies you're involved in, but I know we're on time. Sarah, is that you want to come in then?
No, I mean, I really enjoyed it. And actually, I can think of companies that I need your help with. And I'm like, I'll call you later.
Is another call going?
Bring your financial.
I did tell you I can't say no.
I think she's only half joking, by the way. The other one last question for you. Before I say that, though, just thanks for taking the time out. It's been great, and I appreciate you sharing the ups and downs of the story. I think it's really helpful for people. But who should we have on the show, Andrew? Who should we invite?
Are you thinking of you're not limiting yourself to healthcare or
No, just great companies, and not even limiting ourselves to founders. Like ideally, founders who've had an exit, but not exclusively.
if you could get him, Sean O'Sullivan.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Right, this might bounce back. We might be looking for your help to get this show.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually he just raised a sort of a climate focused fund with support from ISIF actually. So so
Okay.
yeah, if you bring in that angle, if you're running from where you are, Martin, you might attract us to his.
Okay. Send him a video from the hills of
he,
Portugal.
if you he has a website, you can book 15 minutes of his time
Oh, okay.
for a just general, business advice chat. He's very amenable. And maybe from that he might agree to do
Yeah.
a
Okay.
podcast. So yeah.
That's a good one. All right. Listen, we let you get back to it. Thanks a
Cheers,
million.
guys.
A lot of fun.
Pleasure.
Did it.
Thanks for that. Good
Okay.
luck. Bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.